This conference will now be recorded.
And
For action. Good morning. Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'll call the meeting to order since we have a quorum. As we did last time, if you have a motion or have a question or anything, please enter that in the chat box. I know a lot of the participants are muted, so that'll allow us to respond to any of your questions. And it'll also allows us to track the voting for the minutes. At this point, I'll open it up for public comment. Is there anybody from the public? And seeing no public comment, I will move to agenda item 3, which is the staff update.
good morning. On the screen before you, you will see a list of our upcoming meetings. The meetings for May as well as June are going to be electronic meetings. We will reassess the July meetings as they near, and we will continue to send out notices as those dates approach. For air quality for the month of April, we have 58 parts per billion at the Temple station and 59 parts per billion at the Killeen station. And that is all we have for staff update.
Thank you, Kendra. Any questions about the staff update? Seeing none, we will move to agenda item 4, which is an action item regarding the approval of the minutes from the April 1st meetings. That's on pages 8 through 9 in your packet, and Kendra also has them on the screen. Any discussion on the minutes? If there's no discussion, I'll entertain a motion for approval. I have a motion to approve from Judge Miller. Second. And a second. All those in favor, excuse me, please type yes in the chat box. And all those opposed, type no. And that motion carries. Thank you, everybody. And we will move to agenda item 6 or 5, which is a discussion and action item regarding the recommendation to approve fiscal year 21 to 24 Transportation Improvement Program, or the TIP. That's pages 11 through 83 in the meeting packet.
Yes, this draft TIP for FY 21 to 24 was brought to you in the previous month as the schedule has laid out. We are to the point where public comment did occur between March 21st and April 4th. We actually had a 30-day public comment period. It does say 15, but we did have a 30-day public comment period for this item. We had a public hearing held on March 25th at EJCOC at noon, as well as an electronic public meeting on March 30th at noon. No comments were received on this document, but I did want to bring to your attention that since you last saw the draft document in April at our last meeting, there were 3 items that did change in the packet. That is on the screen before you for the Tank Destroyer Road project. That local funding of $5,015,690 was moved from local to local contribution. It's just a different funding category that we needed to clarify. And then the other project, the Temple project, that let year was updated from 2019 to 2021. So that is there on your screen where you see the red lined changes that are now highlighted in yellow. So our request before you today is to recommend approval for the updated TIP so that we can have policy board approve at their May 20th meeting and KTMPO to submit to TxDOT on June 1st.
Kendra, this is Jason. I've got a quick question. When I was reading through the packet, and got to the end of the tip with the financial summary, saw the Cat 3 and see that that's applied to the SH9 project. Just for everyone's edification, including my own, where does Cat 3 come from? Is that a district discretionary source? And is that something that could be anticipated for future projects?
It is district, and Victor might even be able to shed more light on the future of Cat 3. But yes, it is district. We get a list of those projects from TxDOT before we update each tip. So those are projects that do come from the Waco district for inclusion into the KTMPO planning document.
Kendra, this is Victor. Yeah, Cat 3 is the local participation portion of the projects. That's considered the local funding, what the local entity, local governments put up to fund the projects.
So it's almost like the pass-through funding where the local entity is providing it. That just gets accounted for under Category 3. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, I will entertain a motion to recommend approval of the tip. I have a motion and a second. If there's no further discussion, all those in favor, please type yes in the chat box. All those opposed, that motion carries. Thank you. And we will move to agenda item 6, which is a discussion item regarding the proposed updates to the public participation plan regarding environmental justice communities of concern, pages 85 through 91 in the meeting packet.
Yes, so the KTMPO public participation plan is updated about every 3 years. We have begun reviewing the 2018 public participation plan with the anticipation to adopt an updated participation plan in the next, within the next for sure 6 months. We're ahead of schedule, so we're good on this. But we wanted to start with looking at the environmental justice communities of concern. So in this exercise, all that we've simply done is we have reviewed the thresholds that were stated as approved in the last plan, which is 85% tile for the census block group for the family poverty, household poverty, and median income. It was 50% or more of the population that identified as minority, and then it was 35% or more of the persons that identified as Hispanic or Latino. So on page 86, you will see a demographic chart in the packet that shows the total populations under the 2018 plan, and under the new column, that is the newest data that we have received according to the 2018 ACS survey. So again, these are the 5-year estimates from the 2015 ACS survey and the 2018 ACS survey, and you can see the difference there. The maps that are on page 88 through the end of this particular section shows the change in the census block groups. And on my screen, I'm going to actually rotate And I'm going to blow up this view so that those that do not have a packet can see the change. But this is where the 2018, which is also the 2015 ACS data, is shown with the diagonal line. Those are the block groups with the diagonal lines. And the new data is shown in orange, for example, on the minority block group map. In each of the block group maps, you'll see the same scenario, the legend scenario. And so you can see where a block group from 2015 may have been picked up, and then in 2018 data, which is colored in orange, these are still the same. But there may have been some block groups that had fallen off that were displayed in 2015 ACS data, but are no longer showing up under the 2000 ACS data. So our intent of this discussion was to, at this point, just gauge the TAC feedback on if we want to continue to keep those same threshold limits moving forward. And this is something that we can take some time to review. We encourage you to take this information, digest it, and send us your comments. And we'll send an updated email reminder with kind of a requested due date of your feedback. But we want you to be able to look closely at these maps and to see if you still agree with the thresholds that were discussed and approved during the last public participation plan, given the data as it displays now, or if in future TAC meetings we want to come back and reassess those thresholds for each of those block group categories.
This is just a discussion item, but I'll open the floor for any discussion or questions anybody may have.
This is Jason Deckman. I want to take a moment to give James McGill a digital pat on the back. Most of y'all know I did the heavy lifting the last time we updated this and ran through these numbers, and I know what a chore it is, and he's called me a couple times. You know, I've given some explanations of, you know, how I worked through the numbers. He's worked through the numbers, pulled up the new data, produced the maps, and done a heck of a job. So I just wanted to commend you, James. Well done.
Thank you, Jason. Yes, I would like to agree. James did have to dive into some deep data, but before we go too far, we wanted to make sure that we at least presented how it looks now in comparison with the past plan. And again, if we wanted to adjust these percentiles of 85th for low income, 50% for minority, or 30% for Hispanic. I know quite a bit of different thought processes went into that, into the 2018 plan. We had 4 alternatives, and this was the alternative that was ultimately decided upon. So if we do or don't feel that the data has changed that much, we would like to receive your feedback and bring this back for future discussion at the June and July meetings. But we do have a study that we will be on EJ analysis that our consultants will be assisting us with to dive further into this. So this is kind of the first step on how this shakes out so that the EJ analysis study can be more productive with the information that they gather based upon the thresholds that we set for our plan. So we'll come back to you. We'll send a follow-up email, but please take some time to review this section if you don't mind, and reach out with any comments or questions that you have.
Yeah, my last comment would be I would like to see the different thresholds displayed on the map like we did before, just so we have some kind of visual comparison if someone doesn't want to just burn their eyeballs out looking at Excel for hours at a time.
Okay, we can do that and send that back out.
got a question on the chat.
Yes, we do. Joseph Milky asked, when are we expecting the 2020 census data, and would it be prudent to wait for that before making decisions? We did think about that, Joseph, and I think at that point we'll be receiving the data in 2022. This plan is typically updated every 3 years, so we would need to go ahead and solidify thresholds and data for at least that timeline, but we can definitely update it again when that new data comes out. And yes, we would want to include that data as soon as possible. But in the meantime, we would do a public participation plan update before that.
Are there any other questions or further discussion on this item?
This is Judge Miller. I don't know, maybe for historical purposes, what were our last time the thresholds were adjusted, updated, evaluated? Because I'm looking at, how do we do trend analysis if we change our threshold levels? Does that make sense? Am I phrasing that the right way?
Yes, Judge Miller, I will have to pull that up and I can get that and send it to you. Jason, if off the top of your head, if you recall, that would have been in 2014 that they were working on that data for a
Right.
plan approval.
Previously, we used the census tracts as the basis, and the thresholds hadn't really been updated. And around 2016, 2017, we went through and had some discussions about the tract areas being a little bit larger and not really showing, kind of down to a neighborhood. So we made the decision to use census block groups, and that was when the thresholds were changed. So this would be the first update to that map that would allow us to show some trend analysis at the block group level, which you do see. You see some, the shifts in the low income where Kendra pointed out, and with the minority and Hispanic criteria as well. So it may be useful to use like they've done, show the same thresholds to show the change based on what we've selected. Whether or not we keep those same thresholds to define the community of concern would be a follow-on question, and I think it's certainly worth having, because the intent of the environmental justice is always to show the criteria, or the concentration, the densest population of the communities that maybe should be considered when you're planning the project, and how the impacts may affect those areas. So yeah, I think we should look at that trend and see if there's shifts in the three categories that we look at based on the same thresholds that were selected from the previous plan. Judge, does that answer your question? I kind of rambled on a bit.
No, Jason, that's great background information. No, absolutely. And whatever we establish as those thresholds going forward, I think it's important. Like you pointed out, we've got to maintain the baseline so that we can do the trend analysis, independent of how we then categorize those block groups. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so yes, and I appreciate your
Yes.
explanation of that. Thank you for the background on it.
Yes, sir.
Any other questions or further discussion? Seeing none, I will move to agenda item 7, which is a discussion item, Alliance Transportation Group, to update on the project scoring. That's pages 93 through 111 in the meeting packet. We have somebody from Alliance on the line.
Yes, hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. This is Jim Harvey. with Alliance Transportation Group. And if you, Kendra, I think you're at the second part of the presentation. There you go. The TAC received the revised application packet back in February, and from around the March meeting, I guess around March 9th through about March 30th, you had that document for comments, and the group provided a dozen or so comments related to the document. Some of them were pretty straightforward and were easy to incorporate. Some of them are going to require a little bit of discussion, and that's part of what we're going to go through today. Kendra, if you show the next slide, please. Okay, so the ones that were pretty straightforward was we had several comments about the way we were scoring the criteria for AADT. There are two elements there. One is the starting AADT, the current, so to speak, and then the future AADT. And the suggestion was made that we have a slightly different scale for those two, because the one in the future is based on the change that takes place. And so the suggestion there was that the scale for the change in AADT get maximum points for anything over a 20,000 increase. And so we looked at it, and what we had tried to do with the scale was to try and increase the number of projects that actually could score under this criteria. Under the old criteria, the ones you were using 2 years ago, there was only one project that actually qualified for maximum points. This would be on page 6, Kendra. So what happens now is that any project that has an AADT, a current AADT over 40,000 gets 5 points. And any project that experiences a change of 20,000 or more gets 5 points. And then it's scaled down through the ranges with lesser points for lesser amounts. We think that's a pretty good balance. And at this point, there's still only 3 projects that would get the top points under both categories. So it's not a radical change, but it does help some of the projects in the middle, because before there were a lot of projects that didn't score at all. And now at least they get some points for showing that traffic is increasing in those areas due to growth. Okay. The second thing we got to comment on that was pretty easy to incorporate was the labeling on the scores, the scoring table for the safety measures. The fatal and severe crashes was a little bit confusing because we were saying higher than or lower than the state average. But in fact, the higher you are, the worse you're doing. So we changed that terminology to just use the terms worse or better, so that people understood the direction things were moving. Then somebody also asked us to change the labeling on the resiliency score. What we've proposed is in the subjective scoring that in the resiliency score, there's an objective score for the project's resiliency characteristics, whether it's a vulnerable or threatened facility through a variety of different mechanisms, weather or extreme, a fire or some other weather event. And the idea was that there would be a subjective score that related to how well the project actually addressed those problems. So the objective score is to show how severe the problems might be. The the subjective score was to apply that score to see if, if the TAC thought that the project was actually addressing the problem. And we just changed the terminology, and basically you can give it two scores. You can give it a partial score, which would result in a score up to 2.5 points, or you could give it a full score of its objective measure, which would end up in a score of up to 5 points. So we just changed the terminology to be using the term points as opposed to scores or multipliers or factors. And then the fourth thing we changed was in the text on the environmental justice, and this relates strictly to the text of the way it was written up. We had written in there that a project got points for having a positive environmental justice, a positive environmental justice impact. It got positive points, but if it had no impact on the environmental justice community of concern, or if it had a negative impact, it got 0. And the person who asked the comment said, well, why are we even talking about a project that has negative environmental justice issues? And I thought that was a very insightful comment. So what we did was we changed the language to essentially say, if it has no impact, it gets 0. If it has a positive impact, it gets increasingly higher points depending on how high the TAC thinks the positive impact is. If there are negative environmental justice impacts, in other words, if the staff in its pre-screening looking at the incoming projects identifies a concern, or the TAC identifies a concern, then before the project can be scored, the sponsor will have to provide information to show how they're eliminating or mitigating that negative impact. So we're essentially saying projects have to mature to the point where they're not socially inequitable before they get scored by the TAC. Now, there may be some exceptions where something is, so critical to the region that some problems have to be accepted, but it's a subjective score, so the TAC can make that determination at that time. But in general, if you're having a negative impact, a disproportionate negative impact on a particular population, somebody has to do something to address that before the project can go forward in the process. Okay, next slide, please, Kendra. So now we get to the comments that were a little harder to address, and some of these were because there were comments in opposition. We had 2 comments on this particular case related to funding. One of them was, please make sure we tell everybody that you can only spend this money on construction. And there was another comment that said, please make sure you tell people everything they can spend this money on, including preliminary engineering and et cetera. So essentially, in order to correctly describe it in the document, the TAC and the policy committee are going to have to make a decision at some point that says what is actually eligible for funding under the call for projects. Is it a project development program where the sponsor can get money to do feasibility study, to do preliminary engineering or environmental, and then do construction? Or is it a construction program and the sponsors can demonstrate their commitment to the project by paying for, out of their own pocket, feasibility studies, engineering studies, et cetera? And we just need some guidance, and I thought it was something that probably needed some discussion. All sponsors are not created equal, and therefore there's some equity issues there as well. And I'll just leave that now to the TAC and the basic issue doesn't have to be voted on or decided today, but I'd like to have some background so we know how the draft text that you can vote on later. Well, obviously, a lot of strong opinions.
Hey, Jim, this is Ryan.
Yeah.
Since I've been with KTMPO, you know, projects are only eligible, you know, for construction funding. So that's
Okay.
my thought.
Okay, so we can write it up that way, and then if a discussion needs to happen going down the line, then that's fine. But that'll be our base starting point.
Okay.
Okay. Kendra, next slide. Okay, so there were several comments made related to the efforts to kind of speed up or make the process more efficient. So one of the recommendations was, do we want the project sponsor to propose the subjective scoring beforehand so that the TAC gets the project with a proposed subjective score before they start, that the sponsor put in. Obviously, the sponsor would have a favorable opinion of its project, but they could also give you an idea through that of where they thought that project was the most impactful and had the most benefit. The other thing was, should the TAC be scoring all of the projects? So either one of those we can discuss, but I guess we should start with the idea of whether or not it makes sense for the project sponsor to propose a subjective score for their project when it's submitted, and the TAC use that as a starting point.
You are welcome to state your comments in the comment box or by unmuting your line. But again, we do have two questions that we would like to answer here on the call if we could.
All right, so this is Joseph with Harker Heights. With regards to the project sponsor proposing subjective scoring, I agree that I think they're just going to score themselves favorably. However, if there are things they want to emphasize, I feel that that's probably more appropriate for the narrative to just call out, hey, this project's really important because it provides, you know, connectivity between this school and this park, kind of like what we've been doing before. I just don't know if we want to start, you know, scoring our own projects. You know, realistically, the way funding is going and the way our budgets are going, we should only be presenting, you know, really needed projects anyway. I mean, I wouldn't want to put something up there as a Hail Mary, like, well, you know, maybe we'll get to it at this point. So that's just my 2 cents worth.
This is Danielle. I think I was probably the one that originally proposed this. My thought was that, you know, a lot of these, now that we've kind of refined our scoring and it has a little bit more backup to it, my thought was that the sponsor could go through and say, I gave it a 4 based on this criteria. And then that way it was something to kind of give us a start to look at and say, okay, well, yeah, I probably would have given that a 3. So we still go through that process of kind of tweaking the score together to make it so that it's not somebody just scoring their project 5s across the board or anything like that. But it also just takes a lot of that burden off of us. I spent a lot of weekends the last time we did this, just because it's hard to fit that level of detail into the daily work that we do.
Are there any other thoughts on the project sponsor proposing a score?
Yeah,
So,
this is Jason. I'll just say I agree with Joe.
So I mean, this is a discussion item, so of course we don't need to vote on anything. We just need to provide guidance.
Right.
So if you could just, Jim, when do we need to have this information to? We have to have this to you today, or can we kind of gather feedback?
No, what I would like to do is we can receive whatever comments we get today. It's important, I think, to discuss it in the meeting though, so people get to hear each other's comments, so that some consensus can begin to form. But what we'll do is we'll get back with staff after this meeting and kind of go through what comments we did get, and if anybody wants to send in a comment afterwards at a later date, then maybe by the end of the week, so then we can talk about it at the beginning of next week. I think we actually have a project call set up for Monday, so we got all of those, and then I can get together with the staff and we can just decide how we think it should be written up. And then once it's in the document, one way or the other, and at this point, it looks like the choice is between having them score it directly or having them things in the narrative that speak to those scores. We'll decide how to write it up based on the comments, and then you can have another discussion and vote on what we did or whether you want to change it. So I guess comments by the end of the week, and that would be true for any of these items. So do we want to say anything about the not scoring all the projects question? Okay, well, Kendra, why don't you go to the next slide then?
Okay, and on that topic of the scoring of all projects, I do recall during our last scoring run that we had decided to only score the new projects subjectively and to carry the old subjective scores forward. But at the next scoring, which would be this, that all projects would be rescored subjectively, on the subjective side at least.
Okay. So, so this comes to an idea of pre-screening projects. So part of this goes to things like the environmental justice comment that we talked about earlier. But is there benefit in having the projects pre-screened for fatal flaws or readiness? And would it occur prior to actually scoring and receiving the project officially from the sponsor? In other words, they submit it informally or make it available somehow. And then third, TxDOT, in their comments, TxDOT offered to perform a review to look for things like that, whether the project had any serious, say, environmental issues or something of that nature, to see if a project was brought through the process to a point where it was ready to go into the program. I know those kinds of pre-screenings are usually very effective if a project is going into a tip, but I'm not sure that the readiness question is quite as cut and dry in an MTP because you have a long threshold. So that's the idea here is there's two parts to the question. Does the group think that some sort of preliminary fatal flaw readiness kind of review is appropriate? And then if so, is TxDOT's offer to do it appealing, or would you rather see it as a collaborative effort, maybe in conjunction with the staff's review of the application?
This is Ryan, and I think I'll just throw this out there that, you know, I don't think there's anything wrong with having a preliminary fatal flaw or readiness review of the project. It can only help to make the projects stronger, ensure that everything's included that's needed. As for TxDOT doing a review, I mean, of course, MPO staff could work with TxDOT. I think that collaborative effort between staff and TxDOT would probably be more beneficial, but once again, I'm open for comments or any discussion.
Yeah, Ryan, this is Joseph. You stole my thunder. I was going to say almost exactly that. I agree 100%. We should probably be pre-screening them, but I think that whether TxDOT or staff doesn't need to be mutually exclusive. I think it should probably be both that looks at these projects.
This is Victor. I'm just going to chime in too and say, you know, speaking for TxDOT, the little bit of effort that we could put in to try to help screen some of these and make sure they're feasible projects would have saved us a lot of headaches on some of the other things that we ran into by not doing this beforehand. Not only does it save us from possibly putting funding on a project that's not doable, but it saves the city's time on their applications or helps guide them on what is possible and what can be done. So I'm all for doing these reviews before we go into the scoring process, because, and not just the cities writing the applications, but then all the other governments that, as we have to score these extra projects, if they're not a feasible project from the get-go, it's a huge waste of time even putting them in the hopper. So that's just my 2 cents.
Victor, this is Jason. Would there be a kind of a window of time where you would want to have that review prior to the submission, like 3 months, 6 months, a year, or is it just whenever the city that's developing the project feels they're at a point where they would want to be pre-screened, just reach out to the MPO and TxDOT and have that discussion then?
You know, we'll probably just have to play it by ear, but I would say, you know, the next project call that we go in to, you know, 3 to 6 months before the applications are due would probably be a good time to just kind of look at the big picture of the project and see, is it something that's doable, or should we modify it a little bit, or look at doing it this way, you know, to get it kind of in the right direction from the get-go. So I would think 3 to 6 months beforehand would be a good timeline, but then again, it might need to be longer than that if it's a really major project that's going to have a lot of thought put into it beforehand.
Makes sense. Thank you.
I'm also going to also add to that we did do a couple of those during the last project call. It was just very informal. You know, some of the cities came in and met with us and told us what they were thinking, and I think that went to a really good long effort to get those projects into a good application. I think a lot of them ended up getting funded or scored pretty high also. So it doesn't have to be formal, and I know we do also do the meetings with the cities, you know, after the TAC meetings on a regular basis too. That might be a good time to do it. And maybe it wouldn't have to be all at once, but as the city, you know, we're coming up to that time again where we will do the project scoring. But if you've got something in mind now, go ahead and start thinking about it. We can start talking about it. You know, it doesn't have to be 3 or 6 months beforehand. It can be any time leading up to that point.
If there's no other comments there, I think that helps. gives us a starting point to add that component to the process. We'll write it up as kind of a collaborative effort and leave the window kind of flexible so that the sponsors can come in as early as possible to get guidance on things, especially if they're concerned about an issue. Get some help on how to resolve it. Okay, we're good. Kendra, next slide. Okay. One of the other comments was, did you want to actually identify the funding categories that the that the projects are being submitted for, or what they're eligible for? At this point, I think that's a consideration that happens when the list is being reviewed in the MTP for in the financial analysis, and maybe we're saying, should that happen sooner in the project call process so that projects get identified with certain funding categories? And again, it's just open for discussion. And so we have some language we can put in there for you to consider at a later time.
I would say this is a good place. That would be something to include in that pre-screening.
This is Victor again, and I agree with what Jason just said. And I think the main thing to look at here is, you know, we're looking at a big hopper of projects, and not every project's going to be eligible to compete for all the different categories of funding. So I think it's a good idea to split them up. It gives you a better snapshot of what is the competition you're looking at for, you know, Cat 2 projects or Cat 7 or 9. I guess there probably will be some that could spill over either way, but I would say for the most part, most of these projects, they're going to have a tab on them from the get-go. You're going to know it's a Cat 2 project or a Cat 9 project. I think it would be beneficial to do that.
So this is Jim. One of the things we could do, if you essentially, if you essentially annotate a project in the pre-screening phase with its proposed funding category, then we could still score them all together, but we could provide capability in the spreadsheet to sort by the funding categories. And so then you'd have a set of scores that said, here are your projects 1 through 70. But here are your Cat 2 projects 1 through 10, and here are your Cat 7 projects 1 through 20, and here are your Cat, and then you could see how they scored both overall and against one another. And if you had a project that scored pretty well, but you ran out of money in a particular category, then you could look and say, well, is it eligible someplace else? And you've got that gives you some flexibility, but you're also then not trying to distinguish between two projects that are tied, and then later you fund them out of 2 different categories and it didn't matter. So I think it gives you some, as long as you don't break them out into separate categories and score them separately, I think that it gives you flexibility and some control over the process to really understand what's going on with your fiscal constraint and what your program will look like when your scoring is done.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a great idea.
Jim, from an administrative side of it as well, that works well for us when we're trying to allocate funding to the projects to bring to the TAC and bring to the policy board. When we are made aware of new funding available and we're assigning the different scenarios of funding options, that works well for us as well on the staff side.
That works with TxDOT's doings also. I think that's a good idea, not breaking them out after you explain it like that. But it does, the way you're talking about doing that, that does allow those projects that could cross over 2 or 7 to still be within the, you know, competing for both of those categories without necessarily pigeonholing it to one or the other. So that's a good idea.
Okay. Very good.
I've got a random question that may not be directly in line with that, but have there ever been situations where a project that was on the tip has gone through the scoring process, we've got it, that it ever changed funding categories prior? You know, I mean, we scheduled it one way, and then subsequently the funding category changed and the project still went forward. Has that scenario ever happened?
Judge Miller, it has happened, but we work collaboratively with TxDOT when that does happen. And because the funding categories are ever changing, the plan approved by the commission each year changes. So as a project enters into a 4-year window plan of the TIP, it's likely that the funding scenarios by the state could change the very next year. We've seen dramatic drops and increases in a year-to-year schedule. So that is the case, but likely it's replaced with a different category that would continue that project moving forward.
Judge, this is Jason. We had that happen in Temple with the 31st Street sidewalk project. We submitted it through TASA, which would have been category 9. And at some point, I don't recall when, it was around the time I started at the city, TxDOT had some category 10 funding that could be applied to the project. And Victor can probably explain it better than I did, but they were reaching kind of the end of a budget cycle and the money had to be programmed or it would be lost. So the decision was made to put that category 10 onto the sidewalk project. And I believe that it was a little bit more than maybe we had initially anticipated because we went through a long process of looking at right away and exactly what we could do on the extents of that project. But that was a case where the funding source was changed after the project had been programmed.
Kendra, Jason, thank you both for those explanations. I'm just trying to think through, just from my standpoint, I'm trying to think through what is the value, to the funding category as part of a scoring criteria thing. That's what I'm trying to think. And it sounds to me, I think you might have already mentioned, or someone did, that it's not so much scoring of the funding category as it is identifying that there is a viable category or categories, plural, that any project would fit in prior to being submitted and scored.
That's right.
Okay, that helps me. Thank you.
Okay, so Kendra, you want to move to the next slide? So on this particular slide, the comment essentially, if I interpreted correctly, and if I misinterpreted, whoever made the comment, please feel free to correct me. But the interpretation was that in several of these other categories, we have sustainability type criteria, multimodal support, safety related things, equity type things, quality of life issues, and then complete streets is a separate category. And would it make sense to roll it into those other categories as a conceptual part of those scores? You know, are we kind of double dipping? At least that's the way I interpreted it. Let me provide a little bit of my thought here before you start the discussion. But the same thing could be said for almost all of the measures. In other words, when we look at our mobility and congestion measures, our level of service, our AADT, our other congestion-related things, we're double counting some of the places there too. And complete streets has a lot more conceptual or policy-related ideas than necessarily fits into those other categories. One of the places that we can address this is if we do really feel like one area, whether it's the mobility side related to congestion or whether it's the quality of place and sustainability measures that are a little bit too heavy. That's why we have the weighting criteria. We can if we think we're overcounting, when we look at how the scores are coming out, we can adjust those weights to balance some of those things out without losing the what I'll call the policy imperative. The state has a complete streets policy. The feds have a complete streets policy. When you go through your triennial review, if they don't see the word somewhere in your documents, somebody's probably going to ask a question. So it just makes sense to have measures that speak to the policies of your regulatory and funding partners so that they understand that you're addressing their priorities as well. And like I said, if we do find out that there's a little bit of redundancy, we can address it with the way we weight the measures in the scoring. So that's just sort of a quick overview of some of the discussion that came about to get the complete streets category into the program and make sure that you have that background before you have any discussion.
Hey, this is
feedback
Joseph.
on the? Go ahead, Joseph.
All right, this is Joseph again. You know, at first I was going to say that, yeah, we might be double dipping, but I think you make some good points. But, you know, more importantly, I know that sometimes, you know, the idea of complete streets is an intentional act, and sometimes projects look like complete streets by accident. And I feel like there should be a designator that, no, this was designed from the get-go with these objectives in mind. And I think that should stay as its own category.
Okay, that's good. We can put some language in there that makes sure people understand when it's a subjective score, but we can put some language in there that makes sure they know that there should be some intentionality. You know, just because I improve the street and there happened to be a transit line on it doesn't mean that I'm a complete streets advocate. So I think that makes sense. We'll put something in there about the intentionality. Okay. And that'll imply that the sponsors should have something in their narrative that expresses their intentionalities. Okay. And then next slide, Kendra. Okay, I'll be honest, I didn't completely understand this comment, so if the person who made it is in the meeting, it would be great. That would be very helpful. I think it had to do with the fact that this project, this scoring criteria is very subjective because it covers things like freight mobility, economic vitality. Does this project directly address the way my freight interacts with my freight-related industries? There's a lot of different things that could go into this scoring. So I'm thinking this kind of went back to the same sort of thing of the pre-scoring by the sponsor in general, but this is more specific to this one item, where we're saying, well, what aspect of freight is it actually addressing for you? But again, if the person who made the comment wants to clarify, that'd be great. Okay, I guess we're unlucky and they aren't on the meeting call, but I'm going to assume it's something along those lines of clarification. So I think we're going to suggest that the sponsor, if there are freight-related benefits, the sponsor should have some narrative about what aspect of the freight the project is addressing. Okay, so that's pretty much it. I was going to do one other thing. Let me, before I put the next slide up, well, it's too late. Kendra's got it up there. But before we go to the next slide, I want to say this is a straw man scenario on how the projects would tend to score with the new criteria that are described in the application pack. We were able to do that because most of the comments we just discussed were related to how to describe things or how to carry out the process as opposed to how we actually score projects. So at this point, there's a couple of things. We have not had the opportunity to have our workshop where we adjust the weights and balance things out and the TAC gets comfortable with how the weights are affecting the scores. So that's why this is just a scenario, because you could change the weights before you actually score the projects. There's also the fact that there's a couple of items in here that have not been fully scored yet. There are some new criteria that act on the subjective but hadn't received a score. One of them is obviously one we just talked about, the complete streets category. And then nobody's awarded any bonus points at this point. And a couple of the other scores are old subjective scores that might change because of the way we changed the way we were looking at things. So so this is not a perfect scoring, but it gives you an idea of the direction things are moving. And if you see something that looks odd or you're not convinced it's going in the right direction, that's what we can start to address when we talk about the weights and other related things. So Kendra, if you go to the next slide. So this is the top 10 projects that would be scored out of the program, out of the scoring process, if it were done today with the numbers that are in there right now. The changes are not terribly drastic. The top 10 projects don't change. They just shift. Position. So the IH-14 Advanced Traffic Management System went from 2 to 1. The I-35 US 190 went from 1 to 3. But in fact, those aren't necessarily that big deal because we had that discussion about the funding categories. Things would get funded out of different categories as well. But so you can kind of see the changes. The number the number 10 project, which was business US 190, phase 2 went up to number 5. The previous number 3, which was loop 363, went to 6. So you can see there was some movement and a little bit of gain or regression in terms of some of the projects, but nothing super dramatic. Go to the next slide, Kendra. So now this is the top 20, or the 11 through 20. And for the most part, the same thing happened here. They moved around a little bit. The old project 17 went to 11. Old project 19 went to 14. The old project 11 went to 15. But there are 4 projects that dropped out of the top 20 and went to like 22 or 28 or something of that nature. So as you move down the list, where maybe the scores are not quite as differentiated or not quite as secure, you start to see more movement as you move down the list. When you get down into the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, you see a little bit larger movement. So we're going to have to examine that when we start looking at the weightings and the scorings in the future. I think our goal is to try and do that as in one of your first back to having, or first or second back to having physical meetings where it's a little easier to have the conversation and do the give and take. If for some reason that ends up being a protracted period of time, then we can do a more online technology-based process with polling and scoring using online applications. But I think it's a lot easier to have the discussion and come to consensus if you're sitting in a room together and going over it and testing it and then responding to what happened. So these are just for information purposes. I'll be glad to take questions from anybody about why something happened or what they saw as an issue. I won't be able to answer all of those today, but we can certainly answer them over time as we get deeper into this and actually start adjusting those weights. And sometime in the not too distant future, we're going to provide you with a copy of the score sheet with all of the projects, all of the weights, all of the scores, all of the rankings, and you can play around with it and test things and look at it and ask questions, and we can help guide you through that. But that probably won't be till later in the month. So if nobody has any pressing questions right at the moment, then we can go on to what my second presentation, and we're going to go through this pretty quickly because I know I've had you for a long time. I'm probably wearing everybody out, but what we're going to be looking at here is FAST Act performance measures, or at least some of the relationship between the FAST Act performance and what you've been looking at in your scoring. One of the comments we got in the review that I didn't cover because I was going to get to it here was, why aren't we putting more emphasis on the FAST Act performance measures? And so go to the next slide, Kendra. what we're talking about there is the whole federal program is now based on for the MPOs is based on a performance-based planning and programming system. And the idea is it's a data-driven process, and you set clear data-driven measures. You select your projects on those measures. You set targets for what you want to achieve with your projects. And then afterwards, you go out and look at what happened on the system and say, are we achieving those goals? And you measure it, you see how you're doing, and you use all that information that you learned about how your projects are or aren't actually improving the system. And you use that to do a better job of selecting the projects and getting the improvements you want on the next time around, until your efficiency at actually achieving your performance objectives improves and improves, and everybody's using the funds in the most efficient manner. Next slide. Okay, just hit that until it stops animating, because this is basically what I just talked about. So it's this process of setting goals, doing the measures, doing the targets, checking the performance, going back and reiterating again. So next slide. Okay, so these are the national performance goals, and safety. We have a pretty good safety component in our excuse me, scoring. Infrastructure condition and congestion reduction, system reliability, freight movement and economic vitality, and environmental sustainability. So those are the areas that the national program is focused on. Go to the next slide. So to respond to that, in your scoring, what we've done is we've got a pretty heavily weighted set of scores for level of service and AADT, things related to congestion. And we're using in the background, in the back office analysis of that, we're using measures related to excess delay that are closer to what is envisioned in the FAST Act. So you're aligning pretty well there. Safety, you were already aligned pretty well, but in the scoring process, we substantially increased the weighting factors for the crash scores in the program, and those could be increased more when we discuss the weights if you thought they were warranted. In the reliability measure that we mentioned there, in their policy emphasis, US DOT has added resiliency measures and resiliency as a key theme in the performance program, and so KTMPO has added a resiliency measure to your scoring. You've added a freight measure to get at that freight performance, mobility, and economic vitality. You've added transit to your condition scores, your asset management scores of bridge and pavement. You've added transit asset management to that as well. We've increased the number of multimodal factors, and we've increased a little bit those environmental sustainability, quality of place measures for one thing, we're scoring environmental justice and environmental mitigation separately now. And in addition to that, we've added some things like the complete streets element. Next slide. So how is your system performing? So this is observed data. These are rolling averages. So the number there in 2017 is not a 2017 average. It's a 3-year rolling average for 2015, 2016, and 2017. And then the number for 2018 is 2016, 2017, 2018, et cetera. That's the way the feds are going to evaluate the targets, using rolling averages. So we evaluated it the same way. You'll notice that your your fatal crashes for the region as a whole are going down pretty dramatically on the average for that first period around 2017, moving toward 2018. Part of that is because you had a really bad year in 2017. You had almost twice as many fatal crashes in 2017 as you did in 2018. So, so that's part of that. But you'll note 2018 was a really good year, and then 2019 you kind of leveled off a little bit. But the overall trend of that line is still downward when you look at the rolling averages, and that's pretty good because when TxDOT looked at the state as a whole, they set their targets to have their fatal crashes not grow at any faster rate than they were growing already. So the state as a whole recognizes that they're going to have more fatal crashes because the state's just growing so rapidly. But they're trying to hold the line so that they're having fewer and fewer crashes per vehicle hours of travel and vehicle miles of travel out there on the road. You, on the other hand, are actually showing some true decrease in the numbers. So that means you're a little bit ahead of the curve for the state. Excuse me. Serious injury crashes, you're in even better shape because you're showing a pretty clear trend downward. You know, it's hard to tell exactly what's causing that to happen because a lot of crash-related causes are human behavior related, but I think you have to assume that at least to some extent infrastructure plays a part in that. So on the safety measures, you're moving in a reasonable direction, better on the serious injury crashes than on the fatal crashes. Next slide. Okay, so I tried to do these proportionally. They're two pretty different sets of numbers, but VMT is vehicle miles of travel. So that's how much activity you've got out there on the road, and the VHT, or your vehicle hours of travel, that's how long it takes you to conduct all that activity. If they were growing at exactly the same rate, or if the VHT was a little slower than the VMT, then that would mean that you were reducing that excessive delay and you were getting some control on your congestion. But in fact, these lines, although it's kind of subtle, the VHT is actually growing a little faster than the VMT. So that means you don't really have your congestion problem in hand yet. And that also means that there might be some justification for those heavy weights we've got on all those mobility factors related to congestion, because it's a problem you're still wrestling with as the region grows and development happens in new areas, and trying to address those. So Kendra, next slide. Okay, so what happens when you develop projects and try and change those curves for the better? So based on the project performance we're seeing from the proposed program, your new projects are likely to reduce the excess delay in the region by about 7,400 hours a day. It's a pretty good number when you annualize it by multiplying that by 300 or so. That's a lot of hours of lost time for folks that you're gaining back. The projects reduced the VMT over a no-build scenario by about 37,000 miles a day. But as you notice, your VMT is moving from 9 million in 2015 up toward 10 million or more currently. So so you're slowing the rate of growth, but with your projects, but it's still growing. Vehicle hours of travel, you're reducing by about 47,000 hours, which is good. The overall speed in the region would improve by about 3 miles an hour if all these projects are implemented. And there's two factors there that are very valuable. If you reduce your VMT and you improve your speed, we know for a fact, even though we haven't done a technical analysis, that that's going to improve your air quality because it's going to reduce your mobile source emissions. So those two things together give you an environmental benefit in that sustainability category. Potential project level crash reductions. So there are things called crash mitigation factors and crash reduction factors. If you look at the redesign of projects and the improvement in pavement and other things that happen when you implement these projects, we would expect the projects you're implementing to have a tendency to reduce the overall number of crashes by about 8 to 14%. Now, that's on the projects themselves. When you look at the region as a whole, it would be a much smaller percentage of the whole, but that's still a pretty good representative reduction, where we see where it seems like you're getting a good bit of benefit. And that's what I get for doing a presentation really early in the morning. I left my last bullet incomplete, but we'll stop right there. Next slide, Kendra. Okay, so that's about it. If anybody has any questions on the performance measures or what we think we see going on with the projects or the system as a whole, I may not be able to answer all your questions right now, but I can certainly go back and look at the data and see if I can get you an answer.
Any questions for Jim on either agenda item 7 or 8? We kind of merge those together. If you do have any, feel free to let staff know, and we can reach out to Alliance and get any answers to any questions you may have.
Right. Yeah, and trying to send any follow-up comments by the end of this week, if possible.
And we did receive a comment about sending out these presentations, so we will do those as well.
Okay. Kendra, did you correct my errant bullet before you send it out to?
Yes, I can do that.
That half sentence in the last slide. Okay, thank you very much. And thanks for your time. I appreciate it. I know I held you for a long time, but I think the discussion will be valuable to your process going forward in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Seeing no other questions or comments, we will move to agenda item 9, which is a discussion item for public input received through April 2020.
As stated, no new comments were received during the public comment period or during this last month between our last meeting. So this is
Kendra, you kind of broke up on my end. I don't know if everybody else could hear you, but
yes, sir. I was just saying no public comments received during the public comment period or during the last month since our last meeting.
Okay, thank you. And with that, I'll move to agenda item 10. Any member comments?
Yes, Urian, this is Daryl, partner with Hill Country Transit District. I just have an announcement. I believe a few of you probably already know this, but it's a good announcement. I wanted to just cover it real quick. As you know, due to the COVID-19, Congress passed the CARES Act, which was I think, $2.2 trillion of stimulus money. About $25 billion of that flowed down to the FTA, Federal Transit Administration. And because of that action, Hill Country has been able to access some additional federal funds there. And the nice thing about this new funding is there's no local match required. So now it has to be spent for purposes strictly related to maintaining public transit services, and even more specific, it has to be related to operations. But the end result of all of this is that for the remainder of fiscal year 20 and all of fiscal year 21, Hill Country will not be requesting city or county funding for 2021. Also, we'll be refunding any money that we've already received for FY20. We will be refunding that. So, really good news. This carries us with any requirements for any local matches all the way through, I think, November of 21. And we're not able to make any projections yet on FY20, but a letter went out from San Saba several days ago to the cities and the counties. So they're already aware of that, and our board, et cetera. Judge Miller, I believe you're already aware of that. So, but anyway, just for the benefit of everyone else, that's really great news locally.
Thank you, sir. Any other member comments? Seeing none, I will go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.